Welcome to this panel on access and adoption of CAR T-cell therapies. Cell and gene therapies provide promising new options for patients, but have also created novel challenges for health systems and the specialized centers that provide these complex therapies. Health system stakeholders have understood the potential value of CAR T-cell therapies, but significant challenges still remain in Europe, stemming from the fact that current healthcare systems are not yet set up to fully support access and adoption. For our discussion today, I would like to take a few moments to introduce CAR T therapies and their benefits to patients, then move on to barriers to access, from regulation to HTA to healthcare delivery, and then focus on what some of the potential solutions are and who needs to do what to make a difference. I'm very pleased to have with me to discuss these questions Vic Sundh, Head of Australia, Canada, and Europe at Kite, a Gilead company, Emanuele Ostuni, Head of Cell and Gene Therapy at Novartis Oncology, George Coukos, Director of Oncology at University Hospital of Lausanne and Branch Director at Ludwig Cancer Research, and Zack Pemberton-Whiteley, Chief Executive Officer at Leukemia Care UK. George, I wonder if we could start with you. Could you give us a brief introduction as to what CAR T-cell therapies are and how they work?
Yes, thank you very much, Claire. So CAR T-cell therapy is basically the poster child of adoptive T-cell therapy, meaning that the transfer of cells that have been prepared outside of the patient's body into the patient for the purpose of fighting cancer. This has been a long sought after idea and finally got it to work at a large scale with the CAR T cells, particularly now the forefront targeting hematopoietic targets such as CD19, a lineage protein expressed on B cells. CAR Ts are basically engineered peripheral blood T cells in which we introduce in the laboratory through a viral vector, particularly a lenti or a retroviral vector, new protein, which is the chimeric antigen receptor, or the CAR. And that's basically a synthetic molecule which has an extracellular domain that borrows from an antibody, which recognizes the CD19 target on the malignant B cell, and then an intracellular domain which activates the T cell when the extracellular domain recognizes the target. And the success of the CAR Ts relies on the fact that two intracellular modules were engineered that convey two different signals, signal 1 and signal 2, and that basically guarantees the successful performance of these cells in the patient. So how this works is that patients give blood, which we collect through apheresis, and then this blood goes to a central laboratory, which then separates the T cells out of the blood and transduces or transfects these T cells with a vector. And within the course of about 10 days, these cells are both transfected and expanded, and they're ready for infusion. They're transferred back to the hospital, to the point of care for infusion into the patient. The patient, in the meantime, has been admitted to the hospital, has received high-dose chemotherapy to prepare the patient in sort of if you will, a T-cell transplantation approach. And once the patient has been lymphodepleted, T cells are infused, and then it's a watch and wait period, managing the side effects of the lymphodepletion, possible side effects of CAR T cell expansion, and then hopefully very good success. In fact, the CAR Ts have demonstrated something that researchers have believed for over 40 years, that actually properly activated T cells can eliminate cancer. And in the case of CD19, we saw spectacular responses both in acute lymphoblastic leukemia in children and adults, as well as in patients with lymphoma, all sorts of B-cell lymphomas. And now these are approved therapies, and they are the forefront of T-cell therapy at a large scale. And right behind, there is a whole pipeline of new CAR Ts and other approaches, other T-cell therapies that are coming along to address a large number of indications that remain to date orphan of T-cell therapy.
Perfect. Thank you, George. I think you did a good job at summarizing CAR Ts in a very scientific and comprehensive yet digestible way. Zack, I'd like to go to you next to chime in at the patient perspective. Have CAR T therapies significantly changed the landscape for certain cancers?
So I'm obviously coming at this specifically from a leukemia perspective, and the thing that's really interesting here in the context of CAR T is the terminology we keep using, potentially curative. I think most people can imagine what value a cure might bring to people affected by something as serious as leukemia. But we must really imagine and remember the context in which most CAR Ts are currently approved. So by the point that patients are likely to receive these, they're likely to have had many prior therapies, some very intensive chemotherapy, often a stem cell transplant. So by this stage, people are in quite often desperate situations. And CAR T therapies have had kind of really very promising outcomes. It's been a revolution in cancer, and in this population, the whole landscape has been changed. And the kind of things you're hearing are just things we've not seen in a leukemia landscape for kind of generations, really. But the thing that's important to remember here is that this is quite a small proportion of the patient population. So we're not at this point using them in kind of frontline leukemia treatment. We're not using them for the big numbers. We're still talking about very small numbers of patient populations here. And certainly when it comes to CAR T, quite often the hype doesn't necessarily kind of reflect reality, or certainly not at this stage. We're still looking at what the future might hold. And as George mentioned, the kind of pipeline of CAR T therapies that are coming through in much broader indications. So there's a lot to be optimistic about, but it's not necessarily reality yet.
Thanks, Zack. I think we are going to go back to the pipeline later and what the future might look like in that. George, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I'd like to add to what Zack said, that what CAR Ts truly provided, which is revolutionary, is this proof that you can cure metastatic, advanced, heavily pretreated, heavily resistant cancers and obtain a success rate which is absolutely unprecedented. I mean, we've seen the first evidence that metastatic cancers can respond to immunotherapy came through the immune checkpoint blockade. But the success rate there remains very low. The patients who go into complete remission, you can count in the numbers, probably 10% of the patients at best will achieve a complete response. Here with the ALL, we saw 80% of patients going into remission, and that was simply unprecedented. And that is, I think, what is so disruptive about this approach we're talking today.
Excellent. Thanks, George. Dick and Emanuele, I'd like to turn to you guys next. We're going to touch on market access challenges a little bit later, but could you briefly give us an overview of the main pipeline, technical and manufacturing challenges in actually creating these therapies? Dick, let's start with you.
Yeah, so I'll zoom in on the manufacturing part of that. So, you heard from George that this is rather complicated to do, and it's a complex process. Now you take the cells of an individual patient. We're talking about individual treatment here. So each dose is individually produced for each patient. So, and then you need to take that blood, send it to a lab outside, back to the patient, infuse, etc., etc. And all of this has to then happen under high quality standards. You need to have a high success rate because, of course, no patient will be cured if they don't get the product in the end, right? And you have to have a quick turnaround time because just like the two gentlemen pointed out here, these patients are usually in quite dire straits when they get to this position. So it's quite often a matter of time as well to get this done. And we usually turn production around in under a month here. All of this provides significant challenges compared to a normal pharma manufacturing process where you produce a pill which you put in a store, and when you get a prescription, you just pick it up in the pharmacy.
Thank you, Dick. Emanuele, I'd like to turn to you next. Do you have anything to add from the manufacturing or production side of things?
Yeah, I think Dick really summarized it very well. I think what's very important to just give perspective, this, as George mentioned, the data that's backing up these technologies and these therapies is changing the landscape. So, and is doing so in a way that's not unlike how antibodies did about 40 years ago. And if you take a 40 to 50 year perspective, where we are today is step one. So a lot of what's happening is the embryonic phase of the technology, right? A lot of this came out of academic labs, and when we started taking this to a manufacturing environment, we tried to replicate that, and now we're trying to scale it up. But the promise of the therapies is incredibly high from an efficacy perspective. At the same time, the amount of automation, the amount of pipeline work, the amount of innovation that's going to go in the manufacturing as well as into the biology that will then in turn simplify and speed up the manufacturing is amazing. And there's already a lot happening in a lot of companies' pipelines and in a lot of academic labs. And so I think it's important to just also have that context and realize that we're really at the early stages of something very meaningful and transformative.
Thanks, Emanuele. I think you're right. It's important to have a long-term focus when we talk about these types of therapies. I'd like to now move on to regulation and HTAs. So we know the approval of the first two CAR-Ts, Kymriah and Yescarta in Europe, was highly encouraging in the field of cell and gene therapy. I'd like to go around the panel and get each of your perspectives on whether regulators and HTA agencies have suitably adapted their processes for fairly assessing future CAR-Ts and what, if any, barriers remain. Zack, let's go to you first.
So for context, Leukemia Care were involved in the NICE review of both products in the UK, which is going back a few years now. And I think the real thing to say here is, what challenges do CAR-T present to the health system in terms of assessing them? Because they're quite numerous. And one of the problems when you bring such promising treatments to market is the benefits extrapolate over a long time period. And when CAR-Ts are a completely new thing, and as Emanuele says, we're in the early stages of this, you don't have long-term data. So we're talking here about highly promising treatments, potentially curative, and in something like a pediatric setting, that can be up to 80 years of benefit, but that we don't yet know that. The longest kind of people out with this are less than 15 years. So we're talking about extrapolations over a long time period, and that inevitably creates uncertainty. But from a patient perspective, uncertainty created by innovation should be something we look at positively, not as something that's a problem for determining them as part of the health systems. And then CAR-T also comes up against many of the other challenges that you see with other innovative treatments, typically rarity, which means that we've got small patient populations, which means the data is again limited. We're seeing single-arm trials, which means we haven't got any active comparator data against another treatment in the same population. And again, the treatments are so promising that it would probably be unethical to run comparator trials in this setting, because who would want to have anything other than the CAR-T when you're getting here, and often patients don't have any other options. And then there's the high cost of some of these treatments to consider. And I do say high cost because it doesn't necessarily mean they're expensive. So although it may be a high upfront cost, or whether spread over a number of years, when actually you compare them against the ongoing costs of some other treatments that are not necessarily used in a one-off time period, they may actually look relatively cost-effective or highly cost-effective because of the innovation these treatments are bringing. And lastly, obviously, where's the patient say in all of this? So one of the broader challenges we've got with the access process at the moment is, how do we incorporate the patient view? And CAR-T therapies are a perfect example of this, because in each individual case, the treatment is the patient. It doesn't exist without their cells. It's a tailored treatment. So it really brings the concept of personalized medicine to the forefront. And the challenge with CAR-T is all of these common problems are magnified. So because of the long time periods, the uncertainty is massive. The patient populations are usually really, really small, so the rarity is a bigger issue than normal. The uncertainty is a bigger issue than normal, and the time horizons are a bigger issue than normal. So many common issues that we need to fix across the whole access landscape for rare therapies and rare cancer therapies in general, But for CAR-T, it's even more urgent, and given the innovation we're seeing here, is clearly a problem that healthcare systems need to solve.
Thank you, Zack. Maybe I'll turn to you next, George, on this question. And is there anything else that you can add to what Zack mentioned, particularly around the challenges of dealing with uncertainty around these therapies, which are often produced for very rare diseases or rare cancers?
So I really think Zack very eloquently exposed really the urgent issues, particularly those that were surfaced with the forefront of the therapy with the CAR-T, the CD19 CAR-Ts. I would just like to add just a few more things, and that is that truly, and I think we will touch upon that later down this conversation, but as Emanuele said, this is just the tip of the iceberg, what we're looking at today. The opportunity truly with the T-cell therapy is that it opens just an infinite horizon in terms of synthetic biology, of how you can really modify the T-cells and what they can recognize next in terms of cancer targets. And that creates an incredibly dynamic environment of constant innovation, of opportunity to really produce technology that by far outpaces the ability to test technology in the clinic. And the delta in that speed is absolutely provided by regulatory obstacles, because there is very little today set up in our system that would allow both pharma, biotech, and academic institutions to iteratively optimize a product. You test it, it works well, but you can do better. You go back with a new product, a year later, you go back with yet a new product. There is nothing in the regulatory framework today that would allow us to compare version 1 to version 2 without having to do complicated randomized studies, and or rapidly and iteratively test new versions of technology on this. So we need basically to develop new designs of clinical studies. Zack brought up very elegantly the issue of the randomization, which it sounds unethical, right? And so we are in desperate need for synthetic comparators. And so regulators must integrate synthetic comparators as an acceptable means to randomize patients, so that every patient has really the access to and the benefit of the innovation. And so I think these are very key issues that only touch on the regulatory aspects. And of course, we have then the issue of reimbursement and financial aspects. Zack talked about that. And I think, again, legislative environments must change in order to accommodate, to enable, and perhaps catalyze this innovation, which is within reach, but I think greatly today slowed down by these important obstacles in the practice.
Thanks, George. Dick, I'd like to turn to you now. Do you have anything to add in terms of the regulatory and HTA landscape and how they can adapt to support access and adoption in the future?
Yeah, so you can have two perspectives on this, I think. I think both Emanuele and I have seen that regulators, health TA technology assessments, market access negotiations, it has been a very positive experience, actually. Both his product and mine have wide access, wide reimbursement granted, etc., etc. So in that sense, you could say, yeah, it's all sorted, it's good. The issue is, it's actually delivered despite the rules and regulations, not because of the rules and regulations. So it's been incredibly time and labor intensive, both for his and my staff, but more importantly for the healthcare systems. They've been having to work to kind of swim against the stream here and make it happen, because they have realized how high the clinical value and the innovation here. But imagine a situation where you have products which are only, 20% better than standard of care, or 30% better than standard of care, rather than like 4, 5, 6, 7 times better than standard of care, like we're producing now. Will they be keen on going the extra mile and make an effort to get through these complicated systems, then I'm not so sure that they will. So there are certainly a number of things we need to do here in order to reform the health systems. And you can see then that even though you have broad access in Europe, usage of CAR-T treatment is very subpar. It's about 25% of the relevant population have got access to these treatments. And it's not because of commercial, financial, pricing issues. It's other things that prevents people from getting access.
Thank you, Dick. Emanuele, I'd like to turn to you now, but perhaps focus a little bit more on reimbursement specifically. So we know reimbursement is a tricky topic when talking about new cancer therapies in general, but particularly so for cell and gene therapies and CAR-Ts. Without going into any commercial details, could you talk about the types of reimbursement mechanisms that we see being used for CAR-T therapies, whether you think they're working or what needs to evolve in the future?
So I think I would like to echo several of Dick's points, and I won't repeat what you said so well. I'll add to it a little bit at the end of the answer to the reimbursement piece, because I think these are important points. I think from a reimbursement perspective, the two key words to getting this done were collaboration and creativity. I would tell you that there is no same reimbursement agreement in any country across Europe, in our experience. And in some countries, we even have differences by hospital, because different stakeholders wanted something else, and in order to satisfy their needs and our needs. The approach we took was to basically agree on the value that was being created. So rather than focusing on cost, to Zack's point earlier, the value is large that is being created by avoiding a lot of the multi-year treatments with a one-time therapy. Once that was established, we were fairly open to realizing that value in ways that met the needs of the stakeholders. So that was really important, and that worked across a number of markets. Having said that, there's still markets missing from the map. And to Dick's point, there's still many markets where we're just not seeing the patients getting access to the therapy, which is ethically challenging for us, because we know the therapies deliver a lot of value and a lot of hope, and in some cases, long-lasting, year-long remission, as Zack said, potentially curative approach. And what's happening is that the patients are not reaching the therapies. It's not a question of lack of funding or lack of capacity on the part of the manufacturers. We have lots of capacity. It's the patients aren't getting there, and the landscape for that access is quite complex, because some markets are making it harder for patients to go through. They're asking for multiple levels of approvals in spite of having national reimbursement, reviews on reviews of patient cases that delay the access to patients. And George will tell you far better than I can, days and weeks matter for these patients, and many of them die waiting, unfortunately. So a lot of the bureaucracy has to be taken out of the systems once it's clear that the therapies are approved. I think the other thing to really look at is that, to Dick's point, the ways in which we had approval for these therapies was leveraging the EMA's mechanisms, such as PRIME, such as orphan therapies, that optimize development plans, speed them up. But then when we arrive at the reimbursement stage, the reimbursement mechanisms don't match that speed and expediency of the EMA's mechanisms to speed up that access, to do it ethically, to Zack's point, and give access to all patients and not do a randomized trial in patients that don't have really a lot of hope left. So that's really important. Sorry to have gone a little bit off script, but I think these are really important points. So.
No, it's actually is a really important point, and I think you've brought up a good point, which brings us to the next segment, that regulatory approval doesn't necessarily translate to access for a lot of patients. And on that point, Dick, I'd like to turn to you. As a company with several years' experience in delivering CAR-Ts within different healthcare systems, what challenges are still faced by patients in accessing these therapies? And is there more that could be done at a healthcare system level to ensure fair and effective patient access, even once these therapies have approval and reimbursement agreements?
It's a really good question, and there's certainly a lot more to be done. So I think I'll zoom in on two things. So one is relating to the referral pathway. So when I speak to our key opinion leaders, we talk about those who actually deliver this product in the clinical practice. They are all very convinced. And they say, that's not where the issue is. I'm not getting the patients to my center. I'm treating everybody who comes into my door, but there are not enough people coming into my door. So it's this thing about ensuring that there are referral pathways and proper care pathways in a number of countries. We have a few really good examples. In Netherlands, there is a hub and spoke system. Everybody's perfectly clear about hospital A should refer to hospital B, etc. But mostly it doesn't look that way. And of course, it's very much up to Emanuele and me to educate these referral centers on the benefits of the product, etc., etc. So part of this is on the industry, of course. But it is really concerning that 25% of the viable population are getting access at the moment, despite regulatory sorted out, market access is sorted out, health systems say it's highly cost effective, still patients are not getting access. So certainly there are things to work on in the chain here on how to make things done. The second point I would like to make is that there are a number of countries who continue to regulate this. I want to have as few treatment centers as possible. Or to George's point earlier, Emanuele's point, I want to approve every single patient to ensure that they are following the criteria, etc. And of course, I totally understand that this is because people are worried about the impact of cost if these treatments are overused, etc. But firstly, the health system has already said that these are highly cost effective. And secondly, we don't have any overusage. We have a problem with underusage.
Thanks, Dick. I'd like to actually stay on the point you raised about the challenges within the health system and the hospital sector. Do any of your other panelists have anything to add on these challenges? And is there anything in terms of lessons learned or best practices on the hospital sector adoption of CAR-Ts that you've seen?
So maybe
George,
I can. Yes, Claire, and just a short comment. I would agree with the colleagues. And clearly, it appears that many levels of barriers exist today, and some of them are within the medical system, perhaps structural. And of course, administration of CAR-T requires the development of an experienced team in a well-resourced environment. And that then requires a strong referral network around it. So structural coordination of care and collaborative provision of care is absolutely necessary in this business. And so centralization of oncology sometimes is viewed positively, sometimes viewed negatively by many of the colleagues. And these are some of the structural or perhaps cultural barriers. We're very lucky in Switzerland, this is working quite well. So we get a lot of referrals for the CAR-Ts. So we're very happy about that. And I think patients get rapid care, as rapid as possible. But, I'm aware that not in every country this is the way it works. And so I think the hematology, oncology societies have to really address this at the level of the culture and the structural networking of the colleagues.
Thanks, George. Emanuele, I'd like to turn to you. Can you give us some examples of health system level challenges or any best practices that you've seen in terms of access through the hospital sector?
Thanks for the question, Claire. I think it's safe to say that if you look across Europe, it's a patchwork of outcomes that we see, and it's a patchwork of experience. I would like to point out there are some countries where the centralized system has worked very well, where the governments and reimbursement authorities have been very clear around the populations of patients, the centers where to do the therapies and the criteria, and then they got out of the way of the physicians and let them care for patients in the best way they think possible. And we do see some great examples in countries like France and Italy, where we see meaningful adoption of the therapies and very good quality of real-world evidence that in some cases rivals that of the clinical trials, which is remarkable when you think about these kinds of therapies. In other countries, we see, as Dick mentioned before, the need to look at every single patient and still try to get in front of every patient, every physician's choice of treating a patient with CAR-T, which does not lead to good examples. I would also, since George is here, we've also seen some very good data out of Switzerland as well as out of Israel, I would add, to sort of show how well systems can work. So that's very important, and I think that's something that we should keep looking at and define. And then there's also the point around continued education of the hematologists that don't have the access of these therapies in their centers.
Thanks, Emanuele. I think you brought up a good point around continued education. So, I know capacity building from the manufacturing side of things to the actual health system, hospital, workforce side of things is going to be very important when we look at future pipelines. George, I'd like to bring you back in again and just to touch on something that you brought up earlier around pathways and referral mechanisms. Can you elaborate on how care pathways can be adapted to ensure early identification and referral of potential CAR-T patients within healthcare systems?
Yes, so I think that Emanuele brought this up as well, and that is basically national guidelines that are approved by both regulators as well as clinical societies, hematology oncology societies, that are widely accepted and then reinforced. And within those guidelines, there should be real specifications at which point a patient should be identified and really moved towards the pipeline for preparing the patient for CAR-T therapy. And, unfortunately, these are steps that take time. You have to schedule an apheresis. Besides all the consultations and all the approval processes, you have to schedule the apheresis. You have to ship the cells. You need to make sure that the product is feasible and so forth and so on. So these time-consuming steps require very early anticipation of the patient that may require. And what's really going to be a key issue here is that we need to think about these curative treatments or potentially curative treatments early as approved by the guidelines, and not continue to treat these patients with palliative therapies that simply will buy them, a month or two or a few months, but will exhaust their immune system and their hematopoietic reserves, which will then disable them from being able to receive the CAR-T therapies, which are still a little demanding on the performance status of the patient.
Thanks, George. Dick, could I turn to you, and is there anything that you could elaborate in terms of the challenges, particularly around early identification of these patients at the beginning of the referral pathways?
Yeah, so I think it comes back to what I talked about earlier quite a lot here, because that early identification is done in a referral center, who are not necessarily a specialist, maybe not on this disease, but more often not on this treatment. Right? So, and there are actually some systems where there are even financial incentives involved that prevent people then from referring. So yeah, there is certainly an educational component here in ensuring that people identify patients who are eligible for CAR-T treatment early and think about referring them onwards. Yes, that exists, but there is, like we said earlier, there's a lot here about ensuring that those pathways exist and that there is infrastructure built up to make this happen. Because it doesn't matter if you have an individual physician out in an office-based setting that identify the patient, if it doesn't know how to refer, if it doesn't know where to refer, if it doesn't know what costs it implies, and if it doesn't know what the financial impacts are on me, then it doesn't matter if he identifies this patient urgently. So I think connecting these referral centers strongly with the delivery centers is really the key here. And there are some really good examples where this is happening. In UK, for example, where you have the concept of shared care for these patients. So if I refer a patient into a treatment center, it's not like referring them into a black hole, but I'm staying involved with my patient. I might get him or her back later on. I'm fully involved in the outcomes of this patient, etc.
Thanks, Dick. Zack, I'd like to bring you in here at the patient perspective. Are hospitals meeting the needs of CAR T patients, and what could be done to improve patient-centered care?
So I think before we touch on that, one of the things that I'd like to add that's not been covered so far is the practical element of some of this in terms of referral from the patient's perspective. So one of the things we hear quite a lot about at Leukemia Care is the financial impact of many of the patients and their families in this situation. And for something like CAR T, where you're being referred to a hospital that may be far away from where you live, which might mean either high travel costs for family members visiting in hospital, or it might mean accommodation costs to stay within a certain distance of the hospital for a period of time, which isn't where you normally live. All of this can create practical barriers to patients accessing treatment, and it can also add to the impact for patients when they do, and particularly in the context of something like a pediatric setting. Quite often, both parents might have given up jobs to look after the patient, so won't have incomes coming in to make sure that they can sustain things like accommodation close to hospital, the regular travel to hospital, getting home again to look after other siblings. Quite often when some of these things are being designed from a health system perspective, we treat it purely from a tiny little kind of perspective, and we don't think about the wider perspective of carers, family members, and the practicalities that these are real people with real everyday lives. And that leaves patients reaching out to charities like Leukemia Care and many others for things like financial help, things like practical help to solve many of these problems. But as a health system, particularly in the context of CAR T, we have to recognise these are exceptional treatments that we can't deliver everywhere around a country, that we will only be able to deliver in specialist centres, and think about what that means for patients practically and their families. Because that's one of the big missing steps in increased uptake and adoption of CAR T. And we're dealing with this at the moment for relatively small patient populations. As we hopefully see the increased usage of more products like CAR T earlier in the pathway and in much bigger numbers of patient populations, if we can't solve these problems now, what on earth are we going to be doing in 10, 15 years' time when hopefully CAR T is mainstream?
Thanks, Zack. I think you brought up a good point around the distribution of specialised centres and the question of population coverage. I know for patients that are not located close to these centres, it can be quite disruptive to their lives and the lives of their families in terms of seeking treatment at these centres. Emanuele, I'd like to turn to you now just to touch again on the point of data. I know you mentioned before the importance of collecting and having access to real-world data. Can you elaborate a little bit more on this, particularly on how it supports sustainable and equitable access for patients?
Sure. I think, first of all, it's important to realize that in this area, it's about the ecosystem that supports the therapies. And no one single stakeholder is going to solve some of these issues. So the most important word I said before was collaboration and creativity. And that's what is needed with, we represent 3 different groups here on the call. There's a few of the groups that have to be represented in order to build that ecosystem that then delivers good, sustainable, and equal access to innovation. So this is really important. It's something that we're actually trying to do in Europe with the Unite movement, bringing private sector, public sector, NGOs together in order to start to build that ecosystem to move things forward. And we actually have to step in with the times. Right? When you think about the regulatory approaches, as George mentioned before, they are made and fit for a very different reality for a very different time. We live in in a world that allows us to capture data and insight at a rate that is unsurpassed and unprecedented. So we need to actually all change the way we work, not single-handedly each one of us doing that. So this is very important, and we need to make sure that we get there, because we've got what some people say healthcare is and normally defined as data rich but information poor. We need to actually take this data and do something with it in a way that can do that. And the European Health Data Space Proposal is a place that can bring all the stakeholders together. So I think it's important that we do that we join hands across the board and build that ecosystem and work together to ultimately get to the 3 A's that we like to refer to as access, affordability, and availability, involving decision makers in the EU, the regulators, and all the public policy folks. Make sure that the member states contribute and that we get overall a greater access for patient and overall a sustainability and that works for everybody, right? Because it's easy to point fingers at the pharma industry or at the hospital sector. We all need to make this work together in a way that fosters innovation, maintains jobs, creates value, and doesn't just shift the hot potato from one end to the other, right? That's not going to work. So it's really important that we do that. And in the process, we start to really build that digital literacy, build that understanding of value, and gives us all the ability to recognize these advantages and get to a better outcome overall for the whole system, and not just one set of stakeholders.
Thank you, Emanuele. I think you brought up a really good point around the importance of cross-sector and multi-sector continued collaboration and cooperation in improving access and adoption to CAR-Ts. Unfortunately, we are running up on time for this session. So for our final words, I'd like to go around to each of our panelists again and ask, which is one thing that you would like to see from hospitals or providers to be put in place today as top priority to improve access and adoption to CAR-Ts? Dick, let's start with you for this question.
I'll repeat myself, I think, from previous statements a bit. It's to recognize that getting regulatory approval and getting reimbursement is only the start. Then comes all the house on how we make this happen. And there are certainly some best practices here where there were CAR-T plans before reimbursement in certain countries where uptake was fast. But there are some 3 years after reimbursement, they still haven't figured out exactly how to do this. So certainly a lot of learnings between different countries.
Thank you, Dick. George, can we turn to you next?
Yes, thank you, Claire. So for me, I would like to just make one critical point, and that has to do with regulatory process and review process. And not as much of what we have discussed so far, which is basically market approval, but rather the regulatory process that allows innovation to reach the patient in first-in-man phase 1 studies, which is something that we specialize in. And this is where I think the added value of academia is truly. And I think that, the regulatory environment needs to not lower the bar, but rather become more agile to allow very rapid introduction, review, introduction, iterative changes within a product, so that this agility, this dynamic opportunity that is provided by synthetic biology reaches the patients for their real benefits. That has to do also with the data that Emanuele was talking about. We need to analyze results in real time so that we can modify the process. So this iterative loop requires to be integrated with a regulatory environment that allows that. The second point is the approval. So some countries are better than others, but perhaps hospitals may benefit greatly in terms of their innovative capacity if they have approval and reimbursement for the hospitalization cares of patients who get CAR-Ts in the context of early phase concepts. Because currently, for example, for us, we have to pay for all the hospitalization costs, and that slows down innovation in a great way as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Emanuele, would you like to add one point?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up where George was mentioning, because I think the notion of ecosystem that fosters innovation is really important. And we know Europe is historically behind the rest of the world in CAR-T innovation. And I think it's important that we have an ecosystem that allows that innovation to take place in academic centers. But to George's point earlier, also a regulatory frame that doesn't let what is a research project in a lab become therapy for a patient without adhering to all of the regulatory, proper regulatory and quality standards that other medications have to go through. So a good ecosystem is one that fosters innovation and is clear about where the line is drawn and what kinds of rules have to be observed in order to get something out of a lab and into the hands of a physician as an approved therapy, as opposed to as a one-off approach that has the potential to put patients at risk. And with this, I'm really referring to how the hospital exemption is technically being abused as we speak across many countries in Europe. That's a very important place to be looking at in order to really ensure that we have a great functioning system that allows innovation to flow and patients to thrive, and the ecosystem of manufacturers and regulators to be able to work with that as well.
Thank you, Emanuele. And then Zack, I'd like to go to you for the final word of this session.
Thank you, Claire. So we've talked a lot about access and uptake for the approved CAR-T therapies, and clearly there's a lot of work to be done there. But I think if I was to leave people watching with one take-home message, the benefit of CAR-T therapy is only just beginning, and we're going to see a lot more coming through with the pipeline of CAR-T. We need to fix the systems for regulatory and HTA to encourage more innovation like that to come through the system. And in particular, we need to look at how we involve patients in the decision making so that therapies like CAR-T, where clearly there's a huge benefit, we're hearing the value from the patient perspective. Because at the moment, we're not understanding that and we're not getting that data to make the effective decisions so that the treatments that matter most to patients are getting through the systems, not just the ones where it's the lowest cost. So that's where I'd leave our listeners to focus as they go home today.
Unfortunately, that brings us to the end of this session on access and adoption of CAR-Ts. I would like to thank each of their panelists for their insights and contribution today. I think we have a lot of good key takeaways, particularly on the health system and patient perspective, and how this will impact the future pipeline and things to keep in mind.